70% of the world's poor live in rural areas where agriculture isn't just a way of life for them, but the keys to putting food on their plates and making a living. Hello, everyone. I am Edna Kallon, and welcome to Audacity Action, the podcast where we discuss how audacious ideas and transformative moves come together to create meaningful, lasting, positive change in the social impact space. In today's episode, we dive into the power of agricultural empowerment, and we explore how innovative ideas and collaborative partnerships are transforming and driving long-term change in rural areas around the world. I am especially excited about today's conversation because I am speaking with someone who has been an inspiration to me since we first met. I am super excited to have Grahame Dixie on the show today. Grahame Dixie has over 45 years of experience across 75 countries. He has dedicated his career to something that resonates deeply with both of us, which is improving rural incomes and transforming agriculture. From revitalizing Uganda's vanilla industry to opening up new markets for small-scale farmers in Antigua, Grahame's purpose-driven work has left an incredible mark on the world. He has worked with organizations like the World Bank, the United States Agency for International Development, and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And most recently, he was the executive director of Grow Asia, where he was instrumental in empowering small-scale farmers across Southeast Asia in places like Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and Myanmar. What I admire most about Grahame, though, is his genuine passion for empowering farmers and agribusinesses, along with his ability to bring different groups together, whether it is the private sector, the public sector, or local communities, to co-create practical, lasting solutions. Grahame, welcome to Audacity Action. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's almost an embarrassing introduction, but thank you. It's very sweet of you to make that comment.
It's a well-deserved introduction, Grahame. You really have done amazing things in the agricultural sector, so I'm really excited for you to be here. Grahame, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you chose this career field, what got you into this field in the first place?
So I was born and partly raised on tea estates in Tanzania and Kenya. And I used to love going to the company's farm, and I've always really enjoyed farming. So, that sort of combination of agribusiness and farming have been there, I think, from when I was a toto of, about 6 years old, I reckon. So when I saw that agriculture is, flesh is grass, I did my first degree in botany to understand how plants worked. And then I took a couple of years off, one of which I worked for a member of parliament as a research assistant. And another one, I traveled around the Middle East and ended up working on farms in Egypt. And then I came back and decided what to do. And I did an MSc in horticulture at Bath University, and then got a job with a British agricultural consulting company, which had two arms. It had a UK arm and an overseas arm. And pretty well the two parts of the company didn't interact, but because I was the only one with horticultural skills, it enabled me to both work in the UK side, which was studies and farm management advice to farmers, and the overseas side, which was working with international development projects. And then after 5 years working for them, I set up a consulting company called High Value Horticulture, which we just used high value crops as a way of generating income for smaller scale farmers. And we did some really interesting things, everything from introducing essential oil production into Pakistan and restarting the vanilla industry, which you referred to, and doing some work in Ghana to move Ghana from just doing air freight pineapples into getting into the sea freight. And from those, you start learning what really works on the ground. And one of the things that did seem to come out, and I noticed this from the first overseas assignment I did, which was to work in Antigua, little island in the Caribbean, that wanted to export.
Wonderful island.
Yeah. And they wanted to export tomatoes and cucumbers because they had an oversupply to the UK. So you had to go there and say, well, actually, we do produce tomatoes and cucumbers in England. But what they could do and did do was they produced ethnic vegetables. The very first day I landed there, I got taken around the island and we went to see the top farmer in the island, a man called Gardner. But he wasn't on his holding, and I noticed he had pinworms growing on his tomato plants, and I was quite pleased that I recognized what this particular pest was. So when we found him sitting on a sack of rice in the farm shop, I pointed out that he had pinworm, and he said, yes, I know. In fact, he said, I'm in communication with the professor at Florida University with the latest treatments, which shocked me that he knew so much. But it was an incredible lesson that the local farmers, they are knowledgeable and they do have insights. And it really shocked me and made me realize that actually this is a resource that you needed to use. So that was, for me, a really early but really important seminal experience.
Wonderful. So for you, it's really been about making sure that you connect with either the farmers or the businesses. And it seems like you've always been interested in bringing different players together, all working towards a solution. What is it about your job, your experience that you really like? What is it that has really stood out for you that you enjoy, why you keep on doing what you're doing?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, it's a sense of purpose. But, there are lots and lots of other benefits. I can remember in Pakistan driving out of the Swat Valley, and we stopped the car at the side of the road and had this fantastic view across the valley with farmers and so on and so forth, and sounds of the early morning activity, and thinking that my colleagues at university or whatever were probably now getting in an underground train in London, and what a privilege it was for me. And then switch to the evening and it's 9:00 at night and you're bouncing on a 4x4 along a road. And you're thinking that they're all at home with their families and I'm still bouncing along the road. So there are upsides and downsides. But the essential one is that, as you rightly pointed out, so much of poverty is rural. And that the raw material for solving poverty, in a very crude sense, is cash. And that the markets in the developing world are changing dramatically. You've got the urbanization, which means that the economic growth is very much happening in the cities, and farmers no longer have to feed themselves and their neighbors. Now it's a question of not only feeding themselves and their neighbors, but also feeding the urban markets and being able to recycle back the cash flow into the rural economy. And I think of cash a bit like electricity. It flows, and how can you direct those channels so that it ends up, a fair portion of it, in the pockets of the smaller scale farmer.
What are some of those channels to direct cash back that stands out for you into the rural area?
Well, a fundamental need is to understand what the market opportunities are. And there are multiple different ways that in different projects that we have found those opportunities. I mean, the vanilla story was that we were asked by the International Finance Corporation to look for export crops out of Uganda for a particular guy who ran a cargo airline, actually, and he wanted backhauls. And I went to see a man called Colin Leakey from the Leakey family, who was the one that did agriculture. And he poured out lots of very interesting ideas about Uganda because he'd worked there, about epiphytic orchids and so on. And just before we finished, he said, "Oh, by the way, vanilla grows in Uganda. That's a very special crop, can only grow in very special places." And he said that McCormack's had been in there and put in a very miniature processing plant to cure the vanilla, so he got that remarkable smell. So it was a conversation with McCormack's who said, "Oh, yeah, we exited there because of Idi Amin, but that was a really special vanilla." And so, it was a market opportunity. What turned out to be, it was a remarkable opportunity. So we made a miniature processing plant. We test marketed in order to make sure how good was this. We had somebody in Switzerland, "No, it's not very good vanilla." And we had an Englishman here, it's well good, but not this year. And McCormack's, who came back and said, "We've had our 15 top smellers on it. Your vanillin content is 1% below what we get out of Madagascar. But the important thing is that our 15 smellers can't distinguish between Ugandan vanilla and Madagascan vanilla." Wow. "And we will pay Madagascan prices." And you go, "Really?" Because Madagascan prices were $75 a kilo, and the rest of the world is 45. So it was a big ask. So that built up into an industry which had about 15,000 women farmers. And we kind of did wonder, why were they so interested in that it was smelled like Madagascan vanilla? And the truth eventually came out when we found out that 70% of the natural vanillin market went to one buyer. And it was Coca-Cola. That part of the recipe for the classic Coca-Cola is that it has natural vanillin from Madagascar or indistinguishable from. So that was what drove that particular sector. In my job, you don't often see the end product, but fast forward probably 15, 20 years, and I'm working in Kosovo. I'm in a hotel, and there is an African woman walking around trying to find a seat to have breakfast. And so I invited her to join me, and we got chatting. And it turns out she was a junior young professional with the UN. And then it turns out she was from Uganda. And I said, "Well, I worked in Uganda. I was involved with restarting the vanilla industry by finding market opportunities." And she said, "Oh," she said, "that's interesting. My mother was a vanilla grower. She paid for my education with the vanilla money." So that was one of those rare moments that you see the whole thing come together.
They come together, exactly. And when you mention about finding the markets, so one of the things I have seen a lot in my career, especially because also agriculture is the area where I built my career in for over a decade, is that when we talk about small scale farmers, we say a lot about we want to develop their productivity, we want to increase the yields and so forth. But what you are talking about is that we need to take it further, meaning that we need to figure out that there's a market for this product that they are developing and that they are offering something of value into the market, because that's how the cash is going to come to them, right? If they don't offer something of value, the cash is either going to be the same that they've gotten before, or it will not be as good as it can be. So for me, that idea of really thinking about the market value of what's being done, I think it's something that in itself is very empowering, because if they're able to get cash from the things that they sell, and they're able to send their kids to school and pay for their kids' education, like that girl you met, that is what the purpose should be about when we invest all our effort and our time into building the rural economy, so we can have more stories like that. That is really amazing. My own mother worked in an agricultural farm when I was younger, and that is how she saved up money to buy her own little tiny fridge that basically at night she would fill plastic bags up with water, put it in the fridge and freeze overnight. And then the next day she would take me and we'll walk for miles to the nearest market. And by the time we got there, that was just cold water. And so for me, that experience, it always gets back to me how agriculture, it's not just about, let's say, the production of the goods itself. it is really about the ripple effect that it has. And I always think about how my mother saved money from working in that farm to be able to do something that supplemented her income as well. So for me, it gets to me. How do we think more like that? That it's not just about agriculture itself, but all the other offshoots of agriculture. I bet you have so many more stories like that.
Well, there is one that I think it's important, and I think you will enjoy, because I tend to find that development-minded people tend to be very supply dominated, and what we're talking about here is market dominated. So there was Intercorporation, which is a sort of Swiss NGO, major NGO, was doing a project in Bangladesh, and it was an agroforestry project. But what they had done, they had set up in each of the villages they work in sort of groups of people to be able to interact and also to provide feedback. And they asked that annually they would ask these groups to give some guidance as to what was the kind of interventions they wanted in the subsequent years. And they started hearing back from these communities that it was very sweet that they were being taught how to top work a mango, but really what they really wanted was to earn more money. And couldn't the Swiss come up with a way of being able to enable them to earn more cash? And so that was the question thrown to me was, how do we make that happen? So we developed a process, which was a 6-step agricultural marketing process. And what it involved is that the community would come together with the local NGO leading the discussion. And the first step was to enable the community and that group of people to discuss the resource audit. In other words, what are you producing at the moment? What are you skilled at? What are the things that you've got, the foundations that you've got that you could build on? And the second thing that came out of that meeting was not only a short list of 3 or 4 products, which they were special at, but also to form a task force. So the next step was that task force came together with the help of the NGO, and they would do some sort of basic economics and analysis of those different products. The most important and the seminal step was the next one. And what happened there was that these are mainly women, Muslim women from Bangladesh. So we go into the local market and do their own market research. And what happened was that the ladies went in and the NGO would do the first trader interview, and the people would sit in and listen to what was happening. And then they would go off and do their own. And then in a day, they did maybe 4 or 5 interviews each, and there were maybe 4 or 5 of them. So they had 20 interviews. And they were asking the trade about what were the opportunities, particularly focusing on their core products. And then they would go back to the village and say, well, actually, there isn't a market for furniture, but there is one for fish or whatever. It was that sort of thing. And then they would build up a process around it. And all sorts of things came out. This was repeated about 3,000 times. In other words, 3,000 villages did this. And most of them came up with quite transformative ways. And I'll tell you one story, which is, it's like a miniature value chain analysis. So these women, their big product was they would sell backyard chickens to a man called a piker, who was a visiting trader. He would come and he would buy the chickens. And so 3 or 4 of them went into the local town, and they went and they spoke to the wholesalers of chickens. And what they found out from them was that the price of chickens in town was about twice what the local piker was paying them. And they were furious, because as one of them pointed out, I said, and he's my cousin, and he's been ripping us off for years. So they decided that before they were quite willing to put their chickens together, and 2 of them would take them into town. But before they did that, they were going to give the piker a bad time. So they invite him into the group and they sit him down, and, eventually they say to him, and you've been ripping us off. We've been into town. We've seen what the prices are. Why have you been doing this? His reply stunned them. Because what he said to them was, well, I can't afford to pay you more because, I have quite a lot of expenses to get out here. And when I get here, you've only got so few chickens for me to buy that I can't afford to pay you more because I need to cover my costs. And there was a stunned silence after this. And then one of them said, well, how many chickens do you need for it to be commercially sensible for you to come out and start paying us proper things? And he said, well, normally I come out and you've got about 9 chickens, but if you could do 30, I could pay you much, much better. And then there was a pause, and then they said, have you got a telephone? And he goes, yes. And he said, okay, we'll phone you when we've got 30 chickens. So what they did was that they went to some of the surrounding villages to get this critical mass. Then they would phone him up, then he would come. So that's classic miniature value chain. It wasn't that he was nasty or ripping them off. It was a question of the 2 steps in the value chain coming together and working out how they could work more efficiently together, so both of them were better off.
Exactly. And from your story, I picked up really about first of all, capacity building, because you mentioned that the NGOs went first to do the market research, but the people went along and they were able to witness, and then they were able to then go ahead and do their own market research and gain the knowledge needed for them to be able to negotiate about it. And it seems like also what I'm getting out of your story is that there's more towards increasing rural incomes than simply increasing the prices of what the farmers or what the people who produce these goods get. It's, as you mentioned, it's really about understanding the whole value chain, understanding the whole process behind it. And it's also, for me, it's so heartwarming to hear that out of that incident of initially being angered that they felt ripped off, they were still at the same time open to try to find a solution. And I think this is what makes people in the rural areas, at least in my experience, incredibly amazing to work with. They are honest, they are transparent, but they're also looking for ways to increase their income. They want to find solutions. They don't just want to blame, they want to see what can be done. That is such a beautiful story of women saying, you're ripping us off, but saying, let's figure it out. And then the fact that also what they did afterwards was to interact with other farmers, to work together so that everybody can have a higher price for their goods. So it's not just one person for themselves. They're thinking about it as a community, as a whole. And that is the key lessons within the agricultural field. I think we need to embrace more stories, lessons like this, lessons from building capacity of the farmers, get them out there, put them together with the potential individuals in the supply chain, and let them figure out a solution. That is really, really an amazing story. So if you could think of all the stories of empowerment that you've seen, what do you think are the key factors to ensuring that small-scale farmers are empowered?
It does vary from project to project, and they're very context orientated. So I'll make some generalities. One of the first ones is to enable farmers' voices and agribusinesses' voices to be heard, and for them to participate in the design process of a project. I'm stressing the importance of bottom-up processes, but I don't want people to think that's the only thing. The top-down process also is about meshing those two together often.
Yeah.
The thing that comes out of it is that people, once that they have, for example, gone through that 6-step agriculture marketing training process, which is very experimental, and I think experimental is important. When they start acting and starting doing things, they often change things and they grow and they understand what the issues are. So an example, I saw this in India, where they initially came together and got a truck to take it into the local market. And then when they went into the major market, they realized the prices were higher, but they needed to do grading too. And so they started building up a pack house and organizing a lorry to not only go to the local market, but to go to the internet. It was that kind of growth in learning that happened over a period of time. It is that people take on new skills and are able to do more than they initially. So people who sort of think, well, we need to start. So it is an incremental process. The other thing that comes out, in Vietnam, the basic idea of Grow Asia is that if you can get a sensible dialogue to happen between producers, the public sector, and the agribusiness sector, they are much more likely to come up with a sensible idea. They have insights as to what the problems are, and they can think of what might be the kind of solutions that they're looking for. In this particular case, you couldn't improve the productivity of the coffee farmers. They were fantastic. They were getting 2 or 3 times the yield of coffee of anyone else in Southeast Asia. The problem was that coffee prices were coming down. And so how can we lower the cost of producing coffee? And so Yara and Nestle came together and they came up with a process of being smarter with the application of fertilizer. In other words, you provided at particular times and you provided it in the timing of application meant that you could save about 30% on fertilizer application by being smart about it. And so that was taken up as at the national level as being part of the sustainable practices and so on and so forth. But, 25,000 farmers were trained in this. There's 500,000 farmers. It's not moving the needle at all. So the idea then came, well, we need to do this. We need to bring that process from being top down to something much nearer the ground. So they mirrored the structure of the committee at the provincial level and the district level. In other words, at those level, they brought in the local farmers cooperative, the local buyer, and the local government. And they gave them responsibility for delivering training programs, which they started doing. And then when they started giving these training programs, farmers came back and said, well, that's very fine about us telling us how to use less fertilizer, and we're very pleased about that. But actually, with climate change, we're finding that we have to irrigate our coffee. And the standard operating practice of how much water you needed to apply was a lot. And so that feedback then went up the chain. And then people started thinking, well, let's have a look and see whether we could apply the same kind of processes about can we be smarter about irrigation when we apply irrigation, how much? And the consequence was that, and I can't remember the exact figure, but it was something like, 400 liters of water per plant, but actually you could provide less and be more smart about the application time. So once that started getting the word out that this could save them, I think it was around about $230 a hectare. In a situation where prices are coming down, it kept their profitability up. And the consequence was that there was an enthusiasm, that the local people were driving the process, and 100,000 farmers were trained, and most of them took up a whole bunch of these sustainable practices. But the important thing was that you're now getting feedback mechanisms. And it was very much ground orientated and it was very much targeted. That was a very good example of how those processes were refined in the light of local farming experience, adjusted, and it created that level of enthusiasm. And it also taught us so much about how important it is to actually have responsibility as near the ground as you possibly can.
You said it so well when you said making sure that there is responsibility for the delivery or for the outcome of the project as near to the ground as possible. And also what you said earlier about one of the key factors is understanding that this is a process. You learn. There needs to be a learning component baked in it for empowerment to succeed. That really got to me as well, because the thing about education and building that capacity is that it's something that stays with the individual far after the project is gone. So it's like they might not have had a skill prior, but once they get it and the project is gone, that's a skill they can continue building on. And then you also mentioned about bringing together different stakeholders, bringing together the private sector, bringing together the public sector, and so forth, in addition to the responsibilities. I feel like there is almost a myth out there, or a kind of reservation out there, that the private sector and the public sector, it's difficult for them to work together. But I am sensing from your stories and also from my experience, it seems that's where the solutions lie. Bringing the private sector together, bringing the public sector together, bringing the communities together. Since you've done so much of that, I wanted to ask you a bit about what are some of the strategies that you have either used or that you have witnessed to encourage and to nurture those types of collaborations?
Well, there's a cultural chasm between a civil servant, a public sector, and a private sector person, and a development thinker. So the private sector is very focused on the bottom line. That's how they're being measured. Are they increasing their profit? Whereas development agencies and public sector, they're looking for smallholder farmers, jobs, employment, nutrition, self-sufficiency, a medley of different things that they want to achieve. The second thing about it is that the public sector has almost no sense of time, whereas the private sector knows that market windows open and close in a limited period of time. So you've got to move quickly. So there's very little kudos you get for a successful project if you're in the public sector. In the private sector, you get an increased salary. But what you get in the public sector is you get beaten up if a project fails. So the consequence is that the civil servant is very, very risk averse. And he's terrified of doing anything in case it doesn't work. Whereas the private sector guy will think something, as long as I get it right 51% of the time, I'm doing all right. So you've got these huge cultural differences between them. So it does take a skilled convener to ensure that that conversation works together. The other one that comes out around this is actually, it looks like, you bring everybody sitting around the table and you get a discussion going. In actual fact, in practice, that's a very difficult thing to do, because you find that the conversation can fire off in all directions. The most skilled people I've seen on that will have had a pretty good idea of the positions of the different people sitting around that table before the meeting actually happens. So they have a sense of where it's going to go to. So I tend to think that if you can get that conversation to happen, and you can get people to pull in the same direction, and it does require skills to be able to get people to work together. Often what you find in this, that people that they want to have their voices heard. They don't necessarily want that their ideas are taken up, provided they have a reasonable explanation for it, but they want to be listened to. And I think those are some of the sort of key stories. The other one that I thought was, we had an online discussion with people who ran this, and one of them talked about, getting particularly the private sector to participate. You had to make it fun. It had to be enjoyable. No one wanted to go to an extra committee in the evening and get bored. They wanted to meet their mates and chat and so on and so forth. They wanted to have something which was for the benefit of their firm. But the third one is, and I think we often underestimate this in the private sector, they do want a sense of purpose. And the numbers of times that you've come across private sector people that have gone the extra mile.
That is so true.
Actually being able to go back and say, well, actually, the 15,000 women farmers growing vanilla in Uganda, and each earning $500 a year extra, and I've been part of that process, is something that the private sector does want to add on to what they do.
You said something really interesting at the end, which is, I think, is the connecting thread when trying to bring the private sector and the public sector together. Both care about purpose, very much about purpose. The private sector, yes, wants to make revenue, but they care about having a purpose. And I think that's a great way for us all to start, right? So when we're trying to form these partnerships and collaborations, maybe doing our homework to see what types of purpose this partner is looking for, what are they interested in? And I think that's where perhaps the conversation needs to start, which is, where is that commonality? And then let's build on that commonality. Something else that you said, which is really interesting to me, is that people want to be heard. You were right. It is, I think it's something that's so underestimated. Sometimes it's literally about giving opportunities to be heard. And sometimes people think of it as the soft skills, the soft side of things. But those soft side of things are really important. I'm a big fan of them. As somebody with a psychology background, I think it's something that's extremely important. And then you also stressed on something else, which I thought was really interesting, which is something to really keep in mind, which is the incentives are different. The motivations are slightly different. And you mentioned that in the public sector, failure is not really seen in a positive light. In the private sector, it's seen in a fail fast and get up and then try something else. And I think that is something to definitely be aware of, because that impacts communication. So for me, like if an individual from a public entity comes to me and it's about talking about a failure, how I'm going to communicate that to that individual needs to be different than how I communicate it to the private sector. With the private sector entity, I can just be like, well, this was a failure. We learned this is how we can implement it to kind of do something else and to move forward. But how do you communicate a sense of failure with the public sector? I think that's something we need to really try to understand a bit as well. And also, how do we get the private sector to understand that failure is something that impacts careers in the public sector? We need to be aware of that. Those are just some of the nuggets I picked up from the stories that you just mentioned.
On that one of failure, because one of the things when I was working at the World Bank, at that time there was a lot of discussion around land grab and private sector investment. And, if you were from an NGO, it was all bad. And if you were from the private sector, it was all good. And clearly it was a very, very biased kind of conversation that wasn't getting to the truth. So I managed to get somebody to open the books of the Commonwealth Development Corporation of 158 agribusiness investments. And we mapped out what was the success rate, why did they fail, and so on and so forth. But one of the most important lessons from this was that the Commonwealth Development Corporation did projects which involved outgrowers which failed. And they hadn't cottoned on until it failed of how much pain it caused those smallholder farmers that are involved. And one thing that we need to bear in mind is that new enterprises, new developments, new crops are highly risky operations, and that that you can't expose smallholder farmers to those kind of risks. So ways of de-risking or underwriting or using larger scale farmers to test the thing out in the first places, or only using resolved business models are really important, because you can't expose the poorest to the kind of economic risks of an entrepreneur.
Exactly. That is so important, Graham. You hitting on so many things. I'm just like, maybe one day you need to write a book and just put out all of these things in that one book so we can all go to it and we can all flip through it and learn all this stuff. But you are so right. There is a need to make sure that we do not put the poorest of the poor in a worse situation because we're trying to experiment or we're trying to find new things and we're trying to innovate in some ways. There is that balance there that we need to make sure that we have. That is so interesting. And I'm actually intrigued that you're able to get the agency to be able to open up their books to you. That's some power that you have there.
The consultant that I employed to do that used to be the head of agribusiness within the CDC. They had stopped doing agribusiness investments for 10 years. So they trusted him, but they were thinking of going back into that sector. So they were as interested in the results as we were. It was, it was the best return on consulting investment I think I've ever had.
I can imagine all the lessons and all the insights you got from being able to take a look at all that. Wow, that must have been quite an interesting exercise to participate in. Graham, I could go on and forever and ever just talking to you and just patiently listening to all your stories. There is such a richness of them, and we've been talking for over 40 minutes now. Maybe at some point have a part 2 of this conversation so that we can continue talking. I want to tie in everything that you've said. What would you say if you could give 3 takeaways? What are the 3 things you would want a listener to take away from what you've told me in terms of being able to develop rural incomes by getting the cash flow to them, which is extremely important for empowerment? And when I think of empowerment, maybe I should have started it from the beginning about when I think of empowerment, what do I think of? And I would like to know about what you think of empowerment as well. When I think of empowerment, I think of the ability to build assets, to use assets, and to be able to self-actualize with that. And when I think of assets, I don't think of just materialistic assets. I think of assets such as education is an asset, finances is an asset, community is an asset.
What you've just said is very insightful. One is the importance of the market opportunity. And that if we combine that with your points around self-actualization, is that people want to own the idea and take responsibility for an idea, and they will drive the change themselves. And therefore, that particular issue around enabling them in one way or another to recognize that there really is a genuine market opportunity there. It de-risks it. It gives them a sense of accomplishment that they've discovered those things for themselves. It is enabling them, when they go out and do their own experimental market research, to be able to build up that sense that you can have a conversation with a wholesaler. So I would start with markets. The other ones is a lot of the private sector, not all, but a lot of the private sector does have a heart. Particularly the individual managers do want to participate in something which gives them a sense of purpose and a sense that they're going beyond just making profit for their shareholders. And that's something to be borne in mind. And the third one is that when you are trying to bring together those people, they're culturally very different. In Grow Asia, we had committees to advisors from the NGO sector and from the private sector, major agribusiness sectors. So when the NGOs came together, they would still be talking after an hour and a half. The private sector were all over and done with in 45 minutes. These are very different ways of operating. So there are cultural differences that need to be straddled. And it is not easy to bring three disparate cultures and avenues and sense of what they want out of it into an alignment. But when it works, it has the greatest chance of success, because you're not just guessing what are the farmers' issues. You know what the farmers' issues are, you know what the market opportunities are, and that you've got the ingredients in there in terms of the agribusinesses that can actually make it happen, whether it's the guy who drives the lorry or whether it's the person who sells the seed tray.
I'm definitely going to be holding on to those top 3 things that you just mentioned. So I'm going to draw this conversation more to a close, because I know that your time is very precious, Grahame. And we like to close it with something called outside of work. So basically, it's a series of I'm going to give you rapid questions, 3 rapid questions to get to know the person behind the accomplishments. Are you ready?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. What are 3 books that you've loved that you would recommend? 3 books, or 1 or 2?
The Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, is extraordinary. His thesis is, you might think the world is getting worse, but it's not. But he says that actually success has a way of covering its own tracks. So once we've achieved something, we forget what we've just achieved and look for the next problem. But, he has sort of 81 different graphs there demonstrating that rural poverty has declined, literacy has increased. And in our particular field, if you have a look at the numbers of people that died of malnutrition and you average it, and he's got it from 1760 up to 1960, it's a 30-fold reduction in people dying. And how is that? Well, it's the combination of 2 things. And we in agriculture tend to think it's plant breeding and fertilizer. That's part of the equation. The other one is that we've actually got very good at storing food and moving it around the world. And so pretty well all of those things has got considerably better. And what has got worse is 2 things. One is the environment, and all those changes in pollution and climate change. And the second one is, interestingly, that when he analyzes the language used in newspapers and magazines to describe what is going on, the language has got considerably more negative. The media is painting a more negative picture of the world. That was one of the books that I found really, really important. Another one I thought was Daniel Pink's Drive, which, basically it's what motivates people. And in it, he says people want to get better at the job they do. So they want to learn. They want a fair degree of autonomy. And they want a sense of purpose, which we've discussed. The thing he misses out on is that people want to be acknowledged. They want to be thanked. I think it's hugely important. So there's 2 anyway.
Those are two good ones. And I will be going on my Kindle to try to get those two books so I can now read them as well. The second question is, what great vacation spot do you think people should consider going? What country would you say?
The west coast of South Africa and Namibia. I thought we had the most amazing time in Namibia. The skeleton coast, the seals on the coast that look fantastic until you get there and they smell like a men's urinal. And then Sossusvlei, these huge sand dunes, or Tosha, the most amazing wildlife park, and the huge desert elephants. Yeah, I thought Namibia and getting up there on the west coast of South Africa, which is not so much visited by tourists, was particularly great.
Wonderful. And the final question for you, because I myself am interested in knowing it. If you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be?
Oh, Jesus.
Okay. Why is that?
I think his message was extraordinary and such a complete switch from a jealous God into turning the other cheek and so on and so forth. There are loads and loads of questions about, what motivated him, what drove him. One of the most intriguing characters that I assume existed. But it would be, if he turned up for dinner, then we'd know that he really did exist. Yeah.
It would be such an amazing dinner.
The other one,
it would be such an amazing dinner.
It would be, wouldn't it? I mean, the other one, both my parents are dead, and I would love to have as an adult, an adult conversation with my parents. That would be the other one.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a very good one. So thank you so much, Grahame. It's been such an incredible conversation today. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights, your stories, and your wisdom with us. I personally have learned so much, especially in terms of empowering people and bringing together the private sector and the public sector based on purpose. And I cannot wait to check out those two books that you mentioned, Enlightenment Now and then The Drive. And you will definitely be finding me going to Namibia. It's actually on my list. And to our listeners, I just want to say, I hope that this conversation sparked new ideas on how you yourself can contribute to solving some of the world's biggest challenges, whether it's in agriculture or it's beyond. We would love to hear your thoughts, so be sure to connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn at Audacity Action _ the podcast. You can share your comments with us and your insights, or even recommend individuals who embody boldness and empowerment in their works, tackling society's most pressing challenges. And I just want to say, remember, it's not just about the audacity to dream big. It's about turning those dreams into action. And so until next time, my listeners, keep pushing boundaries and challenging the status quo and coming up with new and empowerment-centered ways. This is Audacity in Action, and I'm your host, Edna Kallon, and I'll see you next time.